Dame Rebecca, Rebecca West is not your real name, is it?
No, my born name was Cicily Isabel Fairfield, which is a name quite impossible unless you have blonde ringlets and bright blue eyes. I had neither.
Now, I read that you wanted to become a writer from a very early age. Is that so?
Well, we all wrote in the family. It was sort of a permanent condition. Um, my father was a writer. He wrote on politics and he was a journalist. And I had uncles and aunts and cousins. It was something you did in the house, like embroidery or carpentry.
And you wrote this article in the Free Woman about women's rights. What was that article about?
It was about Mrs. Humphrey Ward, who wanted women not to have the vote. And so I gave her a good going over, as one can at 18. I was brutal, contemptuous, and altogether very disagreeable. And as you can be when you're 18, I couldn't write anything so cruel now.
And then when you were 19 or 20, you reviewed in the Free Woman, I think, a novel of H.G. Wells called Marriage.
Yes.
Now, what was your view of H.G. Wells at this time before you met him?
Well, he wrote books, and I thought that he pretended to be a feminist and really wasn't.
What sort of a man was H.G. Wells like to be with?
He was excellent fun. Everybody will tell you that. And he was also, to his friends, there was an extraordinary thing that is not remembered about him, that he was so kind to a lot of people. He had on the string a whole lot of unsuccessful writers and people he'd been at school with or had been at the Imperial College with. He was awfully kind to a lot of people.
How do you rate him as a writer today?
Some of his stuff is beautiful, and I've often thought that his dialogue was so good that he would have made a very good playwright. But somehow he never got down to that. And of course, all his stories, really he brought the subject of science fiction on 100 years by the short stories he wrote himself. There were very, very few approaches to science fiction until H.G. wrote. I mean, you have a few odd things like intimations of strangers from other worlds in, say, Sheridan Le Fanu. You get a sense of there being more than one ordinary kind of life. And he peopled the science fiction scene with a dozen forms of spookery.
Well, now, of course, at this time you were writing yourself and you were meeting many other writers. And one of them was Shaw, who wrote of you in 1916 to Mrs. Patrick Campbell as follows. When I arrived here I think is Glastonbury, I struck up a precipitous flirtation with Rebecca West, an extremely clever young woman whose critical writings have been startling everyone. Rebecca can handle a pen as brilliantly as ever I could, and much more savagely. We fell into one another's arms intellectually and artistically, and had I not turned 60 and been afraid of being ridiculous, ... Do you remember that?
Certainly I do remember it very well, and it's one of the funniest passages I know in all of Shaw's writing, because he was trying, the silly old buffoon, to make Mrs. Pat jealous. What was that year? It wasn't Glastonbury, it was Keswick. Quite a difference. No holy thorns on Keswick. But what date was that?
Well, I have it as 1916.
Well, you know, I'd known him since I was 17. I'd been introduced to him, I think, by Ford Madox Ford. And I was much fonder of Mrs. Shaw than I was of him. And there was never the smallest sentimental attachment between us. And he was simply making Mrs. Patrick Campbell feel that he'd had a wonderful walk out with somebody young and charming. But it's no relation to reality. And I went many a long walk with him over the fells with my sister, my older sister, and a man who was a civil servant called Slattery. And I don't think I ever was alone with him at Keswick. Men are awful liars.
What did you feel about Shaw as a companion, as a man of letters? Was he he's a mythical figure to us. Was he a forbidding character? Was he easy to talk to? What was he like?
Well, the question of being easy to talk to never arose. He was talking steadily, and very delightful it was.
And how do you reckon he stands now in English literature?
People like to go and see his plays, because I think he was really, I think it's been pointed out before, he really treated words as if they were notes as in music, and he wrote speeches that were like beautiful operatic arias, and it's wonderful stuff to act. All actors love Shaw, and you go there for a sort of performance, but I don't think he had enough ideas, and I don't think they were good ones.
Of all the writers of that time, and there were many considerable ones, leaving aside H.G. Wells and Shaw, who do you find, looking back, the most interesting?
Well, there was something very beautiful about Conrad. Of course, Conrad had very funny sides to him. H.G. always used to say that every 2 years he used to want to find out what it was that the English saw in Jane Austen. And he'd shut himself up in a room with the works of Jane Austen, and then the family would hear noises of breaking furniture inside the room, and he'd burst out and say, "I can't understand it." And that was rather like him.
I don't suppose Jane Austen would have understood Conrad.
Oh, I think she would. I think she had she was expected the animal to jump. She expected the male animal to jump anyway. But he couldn't understand it. But he was a sweet person. I used to meet him with a man who wrote very good short stories, now forgotten, called Cunningham Graham. And it was always very, very delightful. But you know, I must say that it always amused me that Conrad, though I'm sure he was the most faithful and loving husband, very kind to his wife, he was very touched by a beautiful girl who came to England, whose name I think was Jane Jane Taylor. She was the wife of Beams Taylor, the composer, absolutely marvelous with orange hair. And he was sort of rather ethereally in love with her. And so when his letters came out, I turned up in the index and I found an entrance to her. So I thought, how is this marvelous stylist going to describe the woman that he loved? And I looked up and he said, "An American woman came to lunch today. Yum, yum." And that was all he said about her.
Do you think that any writers of today have the same kind of stature as those of your contemporaries in the 1920s?
No, I think partly because they had a writer had a much more comfortable life. They hadn't been upset by so many wars. And then when they got money, they had comfortable houses with servants, and there wasn't the scurry and the running about and the huge demands from the inland revenue. And it was easier for people to write more books than they do now, and to keep up on a higher standard.
But would you say there was anybody writing today you felt it was of that standard?
No, I think there's more people whose whole work forms a very interesting sort of corpus.
What about Solzhenitsyn?
Well, that's so tangled by political advocacy. And of course, to me, a writer is something that has to, someone that has to stand apart from politics. You always have to know better than the man of action. You always have to give the point of view that's not complicated by the fact that you have to bear responsibility. Politicians have to bear responsibilities for actions which depend on views of the moment when the action is called for. Writers have to look at things from a more long-term point of view.
You wrote in 1944, "A left-wing journalist is what I have been since I was 18 years of age."
Yes.
Is that how you still consider yourself?
No, because I know more. If I hadn't learnt to slowly to have a writer's point of view, I might still be on the level of party politics, but I hope I'm not.
You've written more recently that to be a left-wing writer is to be in the mood, and you talk of the peculiar heresy to be told that a left-wing government is the most natural thing for England. So it seems that you have changed.
I don't think that it's natural for people to be left-wing, for England to have a left-wing government. Because I remember the time when it was completely natural for England to have just a Tory government or a Liberal government. It was completely natural in those days. And it would have been profoundly unnatural to have had a Labour government, because I don't know where you would have found the people who were fit to carry it on.
In your youth, you were, as you've already told me, a great fighter for women's rights, women's freedom.
Yes.
What do you think of women's lib today?
Well, it's so many different sorts. There's so many different sorts of women's lib. I would think on the whole it was a thoroughly sane movement. I can't think of some women's lib writers strike me as asking too much of fate. For example, many of them write as if it was a woman's right to live with a man men they weren't married to. But that's not wholly irrelevant. There may be all sorts of women who need to be liberated from all sorts of forms of sex oppression, who are not attractive and who would not get male lovers or husbands, and who might be lesbians or might be unattractive to women. I think it's too highly charged with the idea of sexual liberation.
But do you feel that men and women should be, from a social point of view, really completely equal? I mean, as regards pay, as regards who pays the bills and all that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, my own experience was limited by the fact that if I hadn't paid the bills, if you mean write them and manage some expenditure, my husband would have left them in various pockets and they wouldn't have been dealt with. And his household, domestic ability, his ability to run a household.
I thought he was a banker.
Oh, that's a interesting thing. He was a banker. He went in and banked as merrily as the next banker for quite a number of years. But what he should have been was an art historian. That's what he really was best at. I'm
sorry, I only mentioned that because you said that he wasn't very good as far as the household bills were concerned, which is surprising to find in a man who's a banker.
Oh, no, I don't think so. They're a scatty lot. Very scatty lot. I've known lots of them, and lots of them, and most of them are very scatty. And don't think about the household bills as, it's not really the same as floating an issue and all that carry on.
One of the many books you've written, one of the most famous, I suppose, and for which you're most widely known, is The Meaning of Treason, and the new meaning of treason.
Yes.
Why were you particularly interested in that? Was that as a result of the Nuremberg trials, or what?
No. It began before the Nuremberg trials, I think, and it was that I had used to work on the farm during the war, and then I used to come in and have one glass of gin and tonic water and turn on the wireless to hear William Joyce. James Joyce would have been quite different. William Joyce.
Lord Haw-Haw.
Yes, Lord Haw-Haw. And I, then when he was brought up for trial, the New Yorker asked me to do the trial and to do Amory's. I got fascinated by the subject. Now I can hardly bear to hear of spies because I've just had too many of them. And of course it's changed. There used to be the odd cockeyed idealist. And most of their suppositions were as it happened wrong. But now it's the spies who are employed are mostly professionals who might have robbed banks or anything else. They're the people who really get hold of the stuff and sell it. And it's not interesting anymore to me, in my mind.
Well, now, coming up to the present, are you still write? I mean, you write columns, I know, but are you still writing books?
Well, I'm trying to finish a book. I've had a great deal of difficulty I've had with my eyes because I've got double cataract. And I've had various illnesses. And my work has been interrupted. But I'm 2/3 through a novel.
How do you write, with a typewriter or in longhand? Or?
No, it's maddening. I can't see a typewriter any longer. I write just with a big book, and my writing pad supported on the big book, and I get along all right.
And are you able still to read quite a lot?
Oh yes, I can read if I have the book here and my close near spectacles. I can read. I can read much more slowly than I did, but I do read it. Nobody's got me out yet reviewing a book that I haven't read.
What do you read mostly?
What do I read? Well, I read a great deal of poetry, and I read a certain amount of modern fiction, but with growing despair. Though I like some modern writers very much. I like that Polish woman who writes about India with the unpronounceable name, Mrs. Prawala, isn't it? Or something like that. That's a very good writer.
Do you ever watch television?
Quite very often.
Well, I asked you that because you've had a swipe at television interviewers, Dame Rebecca, as you have at many. You look surprised. So let me just remind you what you said in an interview in the Sunday Telegraph a few years ago. You spoke of television interviewers, quote, putting some minister involved in a crisis through his paces. A man who has never borne responsibility is giving hell to a man who is bearing responsibility of a specially onerous sort. Now, those aren't exactly the views of a radical writer, are they? But more perhaps of a Colonel Blimp.
No, certainly not. Certainly not. Why would that? Now, this is absurd, because this would apply to any Prime Minister and any Minister for Employment.
But no politician has to appear on television if he doesn't want to.
What chance have they? What chance would they have of their own party if they didn't have television, make television appearances? It's practically compulsory.
Looking back on your life, what is the book or what is the things you've written that you would most likely to last?
I don't care much about which book. My best work, some of my best work has been done purely ephemerally. I mean, in newspapers, in reviews, because of various circumstances. My husband was ill for for a number of years, during which I really couldn't undertake any long work. And I think that if you want to read what Europe was like before the Second World War, the Balkans was like, I think Black Lamb and Grey Falcon is quite a useful book. I also think I wrote a very good life when there was no other in English. Oddly, you will be surprised to hear of St. Augustine, which I think is really quite a good book. And I like one or two of my novels. But as for lasting, I don't know if the universe is going to last, so what of it?
Dame Rebecca, thank you very much.